Occasionally in this video, you will see a slide pop up with the pause icon in the lower right-hand corner. When you see these slides pop up, pause the video, read what's on the slide, and reflect. When you're finished, start the video back up. So our presentation today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be really looking into UDL barriers, with that being our primary focus. Really talking about what are barriers and then beginning to identify barriers that we see in our own classrooms. Really the purpose being to acknowledge that we're doing a lot of this work already and then find areas that we can continue to improve in. One of the tools that I do want to share with you in case you are not familiar with it is you do have closed captioning in Google Meet. And this is a great accommodation to share with students. I know that we're not virtual a whole lot anymore, but it's just a nice accommodation to know about. Some of our students' audio may be very difficult, and using closed captioning could help them pay attention. So our goals for today is by the end of the session, you all will be able to understand and identify barriers to learning that our students may be experiencing. And we are going to have the opportunity to share strategies that we are currently using in our classroom to address those identified barriers. I do want to point out to you the activities button that you have within Google Meet. I've got a picture of it up on the slide. It's the square, circle, and triangle. And under there, you have a question and answer feature. And so I'm going to ask us to try this today. You're welcome to use the comment section for any comments that you want to make. But if you have a specific question, I want you to try using the comments feature because it records those. And if I'm not able to address them during the presentation, I can go back and address them at another point. So we're going to all try this. And I want you to think of questions that you currently have about universal design for learning. And it does not have to be specific to barriers right now. So if you want to reflect on a question that you might have, click the activities button, click the Q&A, and then pop your question in. There's a little button that says ask a question within that. Now, this is just a nice feature because as the teacher, if you're using this feature, and for the students, it separates questions that students have from thoughts and conversation that they might have in the chat. All right. The last thing that I want to point out to you on this slide is down in the lower right-hand corner. I have listed the 5D plus rubric connections. So as you're working on your supervision and evaluation goals, this is a great place to go to see how this presentation works into some of those goals that you've set for yourself. And if you click on these icons right here, it will bring you to the rubric itself. So if you're not sure what SE4 is off the top of your head, if you click it, it will bring up that rubric. It will tell you what SE4 is, and it will give you the learning progression. So learning barriers. What are barriers to learning? Barriers to learning are where students get stuck in a lesson or activity or an assessment. For each student, barriers can differ from subject to subject and from activity to activity. And a core tenet of UDL is to anticipate and address those barriers up front. So I'm going to play for you a video of Shelley Moore talking about UDL barriers.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore, and today's episode is called Reducing the Barriers, Planning for All. Okay, everyone, today we're talking about something very important. Today we're talking about shifting a paradigm. Now, one thing that I'm not sure everybody realizes is that in our efforts to move towards more inclusion and equity in our schools is that one of the biggest barriers is the actual infrastructure of the existing educational model. You see, me, like many of us who work in education, we were taught how to support students through a special education lens. That is, a model where a plan is made for most students and then special support is offered to those students who don't have success in that original plan. This special support then seeks to figure out, well, what's wrong with the student in question, and then offers support in a way by offering adaptations and modifications so that they can fit into the first plan. But what if nobody fits into the plan? Because of how we were all taught to support students, as our classrooms have become more diverse, there's been this overwhelming feeling that inclusion is so much work because more and more students need this type of retrofit support in order to be successful. Okay, now listen, I have never met a teacher that can follow more than one plan. So a big question emerging here is, how do we make one plan for all learners from the start so that we can be effective and efficient and then not have to retrofit for all of the learners that don't fit? In order to do this, we need to shift how we think about and respond to students who are struggling. You see, special education evolved out of a medical model. So for example, like if you break your leg, you go to the doctor and then they fix you. And if they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. We get medical attention when something is wrong. This is special education. It's designed to react to students when something is wrong. And as a result, our educational system has become so heavily reliant on processes that emphasize failure, expensive evaluations, and intervention systems that focus on the deficits in students. Well, something that we can learn from the disability community is that just because a person is struggling doesn't mean they're broken. People don't need to be fixed. So then how do we respond to students in a way that meets their needs without creating programs and following processes for only targets what's wrong? Well, I will tell you this. We need to move away from the medical model, that's for sure. So what can we do instead? Well, one alternative is to shift towards a social model. In a social model, if someone isn't having success, it's not because they have a disability or because something's wrong with them as an individual, but instead it's because there's something around them in the context that's limiting their success. Now listen, I spend a lot of time traveling, mostly throughout North America, but about 2 years ago I had the opportunity to speak at a conference in Hong Kong. Now I was so excited about this. I've never been to Hong Kong, so my wife and I, we packed our bags and we were ready to go on our great Hong Kong adventure. Well, I was so excited that I didn't really anticipate that I would have different needs in Hong Kong than I do in North America. Typically, I would feel pretty independent in my travels. I would rent a car, I would drive, no problem. I would be able to navigate conversations and menus and directions and be able to find the conference hall that I'm presenting in, easy peasy. But in Hong Kong, I realized I needed much more support to be able to do these very similar things. Like I wasn't able to rent a car. I didn't have the right driver's license. I wasn't able to have many conversations, read menus, or follow directions because there was a language barrier. I also had no idea where I was speaking because I couldn't read any of the conference signs. I needed a lot of support in Hong Kong. Thank goodness the organization who brought me there anticipated this and made 3 Hong Kong EAs available to me if I needed them. I had a driver, I had a translator, I had a host. But I couldn't help think to myself, like, that's so many resources for one person. What's important to know about this example is that whether I'm in North America or whether I'm in Hong Kong, I'm still the same person. My success and independence in Hong Kong had very little to do with me as an individual and had more to do with the barriers that existed around me. Now, I want you to imagine all the students that you work with, every teacher they interact with, every classroom and school they go to. I want you to think about all these different contexts as possible different countries. Students are the same regardless of where they go. What changes is the context around them, and every context is going to have more or less barriers that can either support or limit success. So how do we support kids this way? Well, first of all, we have to anticipate these barriers, which means we can't wait for students to not be successful. We can't wait for them to fail. Second, we have to stop putting all of our resources into trying to fix individuals. If we move away from this kind of student diagnosis and intervention as the first strategy, it allows us to assess the environment and the context first to find out what's getting in the way. Because the big idea here is this, my friends. The more we support a context to reduce barriers, the less individual resources a person will need to be successful. The social model of support is a foundational understanding to planning for all students and directly connects to universal design for learning, response to instruction, and collaborative models of support. It would be very difficult to try and implement any of these frameworks if we were only looking at students through a medical and deficit-based perspective. Students are not broken. They may need support, but today's challenge is asking, instead, look around a student to see how can we fix the context so that barriers are reduced instead of looking at what we can do to fix the students in their deficit area. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of 5 More Minutes. Make sure you take a look at the 5 More Minutes podcast where we dig deeper into some of these big ideas. Give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of these episodes. I'll see you next time.
Okay, if you have never watched a Shelley Moore video before, she has a whole series, very short videos, and she talks about many different topics within special education and inclusion and UDL. And so I highly recommend exploring her website and her YouTube channel. So what I want you to be thinking about now is I want you to just be thinking about what was your biggest takeaway from what you just watched? What stuck with you? And the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to give you 2 options to share or to reflect. The first one is a public reflection. We're going to use something called Mentimeter, and I'm going to drop this in the chat for you to make it really easy to access. And the second option, if you would prefer to privately think, is to just journal on your own for a few minutes. The choice is yours. If you privately journal, you are not going to be asked to share your thoughts unless you want to. So let's go ahead and let's take 5 minutes. Picking one of these options, answer the questions. What was your biggest takeaway from the video? What stuck with you? So now what we're going to do is we're going to continue to do a little more self-reflection, and then we're going to break out into groups to have conversations with each other. So the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to set a timer so I can keep track of myself. We're going to talk about what barriers within the curriculum, instruction, and/or assessment our students are currently experiencing. And what I've done is I've put a little reminder in here that our students experience barriers to learning throughout their day, both in school and outside of school. And there are many barriers that we don't have control over. But we do have control over the barriers that our students experience within the curriculum that we're teaching, within the way we're teaching that curriculum, and with the way that we assess that. And so that's what I really want us to focus on. I want us to focus on the things that we do have control over and not all of those outside influences that we can't control. So this one, I'm only giving you one way to share your answer. And this is because I want us to compile all of our answers in one place for us to use for the next activity. So what you're going to use is you are going to use something called Slido. And I'm going to link it here into the chat, but you are also going to need the code that is posted on this slide. So once you click on that link, it's going to ask for a code, and you're going to enter 264146. And what this is going to do is it's going to ask you the same question that I have on this slide, and you are going to put in as many answers as you want, identifying the barriers that students, whether it's in your classroom or whether it is like potential barriers that students might experience throughout their day. I am going to give us right now, we have just under 8.5 minutes. I am going to give us the full time. Sometimes those good ideas come at the very end. So what we're going to do is that we're going to take these and we are going to break out into breakout groups. And your group is going to be tasked with starting off by just picking one barrier and brainstorming what are supports that you can put in place to break down that barrier for your student. And think about, as your team is brainstorming, because you're going to be mixed groups, but think about, does it look different at different grade levels? Does it look different during in different content areas? And just brainstorm all the ideas that you have, and so that this just becomes a reference that we can look back on as we move forward with UDL work and looking at lesson plans. So I'm going to capture what we have here. And once I break you out into breakout groups, you are going to have someone hopefully volunteer to be your note taker. And you are going to, I've created Google Slides for you. If Google Slides is not your thing, you can take notes on paper and then give it to myself or any of the other coaches at a later time, and we can enter this stuff into Google Slides. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in Google Slides. So we will, all right, I have pasted the image of the barriers that you all identified. You can pick from here, or if there are other barriers that didn't come up here that your group wants to tackle, you are welcome to choose from there. You're going to find the slide that goes with your group number when you're broken out into breakout groups. It tells you what room you are. Just find the slide. If you're room 1, go to group 1. If you're room 2, and you can put the identified barrier where it says barrier and then brainstorm possible UDL supports under that area. What questions do you have before I break you out into breakout groups? Okay, I have pasted the link for this document, and I am going to put you into breakout groups, I think for about 10 minutes. If we come back and people feel like they were on a roll and they would like more time, then we can go back into breakout groups and take some additional time. If you do one barrier and you finish it and you'd like to tackle a second one, your group is welcome to do that as well. So I'm going to break you out into 3 groups. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. And there you are. Nothing. Are there any groups that are willing to share what they talked about?
I will, Corey.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amy.
We started off by, I gave an example of a struggle I'm having right now, and a young student who has recently been diagnosed with ADHD, and how we can all support the teacher in coming up with a plan. And we're realizing, oh, more and more students have this distractibility piece. So we talked about what are some things we can do for her, or really all students in that room. So the barrier is distractibility during learning. And the first thing was, does the student identify the barrier for themselves? Do they know when they're being distracted? And that maybe help students realize when they're distracted and help them come back. Whole class brain breaks, or if you have a student on a plan, give them the brain break card, and the teacher needs to identify, oh, well, if this one's distracted, probably someone else is too, and maybe have a quick break coming up. Less virtual, so less computer screens. Choice in assignments, so break down the work. If you, okay, just do page 2, or you have to choose one of these 3 things to work on. Whole body teaching and reteaching. Movement, whether it be you're working on your letter sounds, every time you hear a certain letter, stomp your feet twice, that sort of thing. Just kind of be creative in that way. And awareness of where the focus goes towards. So helping students really identify for themselves, where should you be focused? So okay, noticing when you're distracted and come back to it. So that was kind of what we talked about.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Does anybody else want to share out from their group? Not a requirement, totally optional.
Yeah, we in group 3 we talked about two main barriers. One was the lack of social skills and social connection amongst students, and the possible supports that we briefly brainstormed include SEL curricula, social groupings, intentional social groupings guided by staff, explicit instruction of social norms, and informal unplanned support in a class setting. That moment when you just respond to a situation. We mentioned that it currently feels more like we're putting out fires than supporting emotional needs. And how do we proactively plan, I guess, to put out the fires more intentionally or more permanently, more supportively? We said that seating can help, whether it's because they can sit next to a student who they can follow that modeled behavior, or a student who's perhaps more able to provide explicit ideas about what to do and what not to do. But yeah, it seems like there was a big open topic there with a lot of other potential ideas. The other one we hit was specifically challenged readers being unable to access grade level content, so that specifically at upper L and middle and high school levels, students who are not reading at grade level simply don't get access to the educational content because so much of it is written formats. So we talked a little bit about the read-write add-on for Google Chrome, so that any text can be read to the student and that they can speak their answers and have them written. Providing videos of the lesson, kind of a flipped classroom idea, that so that students can access the lessons whenever and wherever they need to, as opposed to only having the lesson once in a classroom. And we kind of got cut off there, so we weren't quite finished, but I think we covered it fairly well.
Great, thank you, Wade. Group 1, did you have anything that you wanted to share?
I can share. We ran out of time before we could get it on the chart, but we were talking about all of those really fit in the group we were in, but one that stood out was that time to collaborate. I think that's such a key to doing UDL in the right way, and we just don't seem to ever have time for that. Me talking to a teacher, as they're going by me, is not collaborating. And I just wish, and I don't know, where that comes from, but I just wish we had more time to do that, so that we could do this with fidelity and help each other with the barriers. So that was just kind of one of the things we were touching on, and we just didn't get time to put it in our document.
Lori, I really like that you brought that up. When I think of barriers, I often think, specifically to the students, what can we do for the students? And sometimes what we need to do for the students is on our end with other adults, right? I mean, we are each other's best resources. And so that time to tap into each other is really important for our students. Okay, so this is the point where I am going to give you time, and Amy, good point, right?
Yeah, to be determined. It's under conversation at the state level and no idea yet.
So the rest of your time does not need to be spent on a Google Meet. The Meet will be open for you to come on, have discussions. You can have discussions with each other. If you have a question, you can pop on. But what I want you to do is spend the remainder of the time furthering your learning. And this can be done by looking at an upcoming lesson or unit and just identifying some potential barriers that might exist in that lesson or unit. And then brainstorm a few supports. And I've given you some resources that might help you with this. I will point out this UDL Strategies and this Would You Rather UDL edition are really great because they specifically list potential barriers that students might find. And so if you're really not sure what barriers might pop up in a lesson, these are good resources to look at. We always want to make a sustainable plan with our work. You know, if you're looking at a lesson, then what are you going to do with it? You then want to reflect on how the lesson went, and you want to make adjustments and improvements. And so I've provided some resources of rubrics and flowcharts to just kind of help that progress. Someone did ask in the question and answer about a gentle release of UDL without overwhelming this shift. And that was, these rubrics and flowcharts can help with that because it can give you a starting point. My best advice is that you can't do it all, and you can't do it all well at once. You have to start and pick just one small thing. And so that's why this session is not necessarily looking at UDL as a whole. It's really just narrowing in on one thing, identifying barriers. And to make it even more manageable, it doesn't have to be identifying every barrier that is going to be there for every student in your classroom. You know, start with identifying one barrier and working to remove just that one barrier and try one new thing in your classroom. And then I just wanted to point out, and I'm not going to read these to you, but this is, we've presented this to several schools so far, and then now SU-wide, just some of the UDL strategies that we've tried to embed into this presentation you can look at, as well as we have acknowledged that there were some missed opportunities. You are not going to break down every single barrier for your students, right? But for me, acknowledging that these were things that I could have done to help participants is going to help me improve next time. When I shared this, the first time I did this was with West Rutland staff, and I shared the agenda with Jay, and he looked it over, great feedback. But his one comment was on the video, boy, Shelley Moore talks really fast, right? Providing students with a way to slow down videos is really helpful. I did not give you that opportunity, but acknowledging it lets me know, boy, next time I need to build that in. And then I've just linked the exit ticket into your presentation. So I'm going to stop presenting. And I think what I'm going to try to do is, you are welcome to sign off and go, you know, work on this and look at your own lesson plans. I'm going to try to address some of the questions that you submitted in the question and answer. And I'm going to tell you, I am not a UDL expert. I do not have all the answers. But maybe one of the things that you do want to do is you want to stay and engage in conversation with colleagues around some of these questions. I believe you can see all of them. But one of the questions was, does UDL always aim high or low to meet students' needs, or is targeting the center ever a viable option? And I think, and of course, this is what I have gained from just from my own learning, and I may be wrong, but my opinion is that we're holding all students to high standards. We're always aiming high, and then we're putting the supports in place to help all students be successful. And I'm opening this up. I don't want to be the only one to speak. So if you have thoughts, more questions, you know, this is open time for you. Go ahead and unmute yourselves and talk away.
I think a challenge for a classroom teacher would be keeping everybody accountable while having so many options. So if you give a student a device to access their text, but the other student is reading a different text, how would you do it all? So I could see that being a big challenge or a barrier for implementing it in the classroom.
So a big piece of that I found over the years, Amy, is that you want to have conversations with your classroom about knowing yourself as a learner and knowing what works for you and knowing what doesn't work for you. So if you're offering, like, let's say an audio option, a read to self option, a graphic novel option of the same text, you're having conversations around those kids of identifying which one of those is the best option or the best fit for you. And then the kids are able to pick which one works for them. And you might have kids who go to the audio option, and that's fine, because even though they can read that text option, maybe last night they didn't sleep and today they're really tired and they just want to listen to the book. So like kind of like having those conversations. And then if we find a student who's always going to that option to support them when we don't think they need that support, it kind of becomes that conversation of, hey, I'm noticing you're always using this option. Let's try this and see what happens, kind of thing. That's something that I found works.
Well, I think it's I can see how the accountability piece would be challenging though. So how do you know that, like, I can see, so I'm not a classroom teacher right now, but I've heard from some of my colleagues that it's hard for them to be working with one group and then have everybody else doing something different, and making sure that while they're doing something different, they're still being productive and not. So I mean, that piece is challenging for them.
Any other thoughts on that question? Okay. You can always come back. So these questions all saved. So as I find resources, I can make them available to everyone in the district. And hopefully together we'll come to some of these answers. So another question is, how can we support all teachers K-12 in increasing the engagement level in their classroom? That is a good question. Thoughts? I don't have answers. Yeah, Courtney, Abby is a really great resource, right? Thinking back to when Courtney and I were partner teachers, that we worked with Abby to implement Kagan strategies into our classroom, which really increased the amount of engagement that was happening. So maybe the answer is just more PD. I know that's like yes, but no, right? We cringe a little bit at more PD, but finding more resources and leveraging the expertise that we have within our district.
Corey, what was that strategy you just talked about?
Kagan Strategies, Kagan.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is exactly?
Yep. So Kagan Strategies are structured to allow students to collaborate with each other. So, like we do turn and talk in our classroom, right? It's somewhat along those lines, but it's a little more in depth. So, and I can't think of all of them off of the top of my head or their names, but, a good example that I would use in my classroom is if we were working on math problems and I wanted students to collaborate, each group, they would be broken out into like four students per group, and they would be given one worksheet. And student number one solves problem number one, and they have to do it on the paper, but they also have to verbalize it to their group to make sure their group is understanding, and that questions can be asked of the student doing work. And then the paper gets passed to the next kid, and the next kid solves problem number two, and there's discussion amongst groups so that there's collaboration, there's conversation, and every student is responsible for doing work, but they have support that's built in. And that's just one example. But what I can do is, she did do a lunch and learn at one point where she discussed some of those strategies. So I can get those and post them on the website. And if people are interested, I can also send out an email with resources. And it looks like maybe Amy linked something in the chat as well. Cooperative learning cards.
I think my biggest challenge around UDL is I feel very confident in UDL and implementing UDL in my classroom. But then when I think to the end of the year in SBAC is a barrier in and of itself for many of our students. So I guess for me, it's that trying to balance how do we help them to be successful on that when SBAC doesn't have any UDL practices in place. And I know that's a very hard topic to like wrap your brain around. But for me, it's like, I feel very confident in UDL and my kids feel very successful in the classroom. And then they open this and I can't read this. And it's like, okay, well, there's no audio option. There's no, like, for some of it, even if it is in their accommodation, it's still, there's parts of it that the accommodations just aren't helpful. And I think that becomes a barrier in and of itself for students. And I know it's not a question I'm going to get an answer ever to, but it's just something that's hard to wrap my head around this is the best way for students to learn and to grow. And then at the end of the year, we give them something that makes them feel like they can't do it anymore. And that's trying to scaffold them to that point, but it's kind of hard. So that's something I'm working on.
Yeah. I think, Courtney, you're getting right at like that content standards versus method standards and how we accommodate those in our classrooms using UDL strategies versus how they're assessed on this, kind of final product. There are a ton of UDL features built into SBAC, obviously. And like, there's a, million, like, reducing what's on the amount of information on your screen and highlighting and like all of these tools that are intentionally built in. But when it comes to the method standard, like, can a student read a piece of grade level text and make meaning of that text, right? Like there's no other strategy around that. It's a method standard. So it's evaluating whether or not the student can do that. And if they can't, then it's going to be a struggle and an unsuccessful experience for them. And that's, I think sometimes, like Katie Novak talks about this all the time. She's been working with our principals and we've gotten to do a great series with her, but she talks a lot about this and for teachers finding the right balance, right, between putting in place UDL strategies for content and method. But at some point in time, there's a method standard. The kid has to perform to that standard. So how do we use the other entry level pathway strategies to get the student to that standard?
Megan?
I think about the social emotional side of like what you guys are talking about, and it's kind of like, so all year long we're giving them different pathways and opportunities, everything feels great and amazing, and then it's like the end of the year and then they go to the next grade. But how do we make them not feel deflated when their content standard doesn't capture that piece, because you're going to have kids who are right on the cusp, and how do we express that in a way that keeps their social emotional and just approaches to learning positive and helpful, and then they take this big mamma jamma test and it's very overwhelming even with the UDL in it, and then getting your jump rope content covered by the end of the year and that stuff. So I always think about our kids who need that extra time, and they can have so much of that extra time until a certain point, because, the year does end. So great, it took maybe till October to master this, and the student needed until the end of November or December, but how do we provide those opportunities for them without being like, and now you have to go to summer school, or like, something that then deflates that.
Megan, I agree. It comes back to that idea of a pacing guide, and that we have all these pacing guides, but our kids don't always fit into a pacing guide. My fourth graders are not going to master this. All of them are not going to master this standard by the end of October. But because of my pacing guide, I have to move on because this big looming test is coming at the end of the year to make sure they have been taught these things. And it becomes that. So we move on without them. Their mastery goes down, or their mastery is not there. And then we move on to something else. And we should be implementing things in our classroom to have them continue work on that mastery, but we're one person, and one person trying to address all those needs for all your students is very difficult and very hard. So it does create this thing of the pacing guide pushes the kids along before they're ready. And yes, we can be doing more to go back and work with them. But at the same time, we're one person who's now being expected to teach what the pacing guide says and teach all the standards that these students haven't mastered, and reteach these standards that these students haven't mastered. And even with intervention times, it's still not enough for what our kids need to be successful. And I think that's another barrier for adults with UDL versus a barrier for kids.
Totally. So like, I will be honest, I was the person who asked that gradual release question about UDL in the initial beginnings of this. And I think that like everything you just said, Courtney, about like, it can become this really like, and you can, try little like tapas of it and get it kind of, but like, Colby and I, we talk about it with the math curriculum and stuff too. And it's kind of like, how does all of this jive and coincide, and proficiency and social emotional, but the standard test, like it's so much.
I feel the same way, Megan. I feel like they all rub up against each other, and it's like we have to pick which one we feel is most important in that moment, even trying to make them jive. But it's like, okay, we got standardized testing rubbing up against proficiency, rubbing up against project-based learning, rubbing up against UDL strategies, and they all have similar components, except for the standardized one. That one kind of stands by itself, but they all have similar components. But then that standardized one always comes back into play, which kind of throws your whole thing off, and you're kind of left wondering, how am I doing this to the best of my ability? How am I helping all my students to be successful? And that's the hardest part, when success is determined by something that is very standardized. When UDL and things like that, we are pushing more towards, not accommodation, that's not the word I'm looking for, personalized learning. That's the word I'm looking for.
So this is all really great conversation, and I do not have answers to it. I think it's the big conundrum of education, right? Doing what we know is best for kids and balancing that with the requirements that come down from the state level. So at this point, you are all welcome to stay on and continue to chat with each other, or you're welcome to log off and begin looking at lesson plans that you might want to tackle for the future with a UDL lens. I am going to just put a little bit of a plug in that we are running one more UDL session this afternoon. So if you are wondering what this looks like in practice, during the afternoon session, we are looking at an ELA assessment before UDL supports were put in place, and then after, and comparing them. And we are also looking at a PE assessment and looking at what that looks like before UDL supports and after. So if that's something that is interesting to you, feel free to log on and join in the afternoon. Otherwise, you guys are welcome to use the rest of the time to work.